Turning in our Bibles then this morning to 1 Timothy, or on the wall here, 3 verse 11 is what we want to think of today. Thinking of the wives of deacons. Their wives likewise must be dignified, not slanderers, but sober-minded, faithful in all things. And as we consider electing deacons, this verse emphasizes that we're also to consider the wife of potential deacons. And I'm beginning with this aspect of deacons in our study of deacons for 4 reasons. First of all, an apologetic reason. Our church maintains that all deacons should be male. The list that you have been given or will be given today to choose from in the voting for deacons are all male members of the church. You may be questioning that position. And so we're beginning our studies on deacons with defending and explaining that position of our church. Secondly, there's a pastoral reason. The pastoral reason is to emphasize to you, and especially to the woman in the congregation, the important role that you play in the work of our deacons. Half our congregation is female. We're beginning our studies of deacons with emphasizing the female involvement in this role. We're doing this so that none of you will feel left out, switch off during the sermon, say, I'm not going to the midweek because it's a discussion about deacons, which has nothing to do with me. All of us are involved in this important process of electing deacons and their wives, and then in supporting those elected deacons and their wives. Young people discuss in their RE classes in secondary school male and female leadership within different denominations. They discuss feminism. They discuss equality in society. And all of those discussions impinge on our study of deacons at this time. There's a theological reason, thirdly, for beginning with the wives of deacons. I want to use historical theology, not systematic or biblical theology at this time, but historical theology to emphasize to you and make you aware that while deaconesses in a church is not a liberal view or is not a new view, it is also not our view. In a moment, I'm going to show you that deaconesses is not a new idea within the Christian church. I'll also use historical theology to show you that deaconesses is not a liberal view within the Christian church. But I also want to show you today that it's not our view within the Christian church. And then fourthly, there's an exegetical reason for beginning with this 11th verse. It's easy for us, in reading this paragraph on deacons, to allow this point about the wives of deacons to be lost in our study of this passage. How many sermons have you ever heard on the wives of deacons? How often do we emphasize their qualifications and their roles within the deacon ministry of our church? But here it is in verse 11. And so to highlight this point, this ministry, the importance of this, we're beginning with this aspect of deacons in our studies. So here in verse 11, Paul introduces a new class of people closely associated with deacons, as indicated by the opening term, likewise. And he mentions 4 characteristics which are to mark these people: dignified, not malicious gossips, temperate, faithful in all things. Today we want to think of 3 points of this verse: the subjects of these qualifications, the substance of these qualifications, and the significance. Why are they here? What's he mentioning this for? The significance of these qualifications. Firstly, the subject of these qualifications in verse number 11. And this has been widely debated, and this is where the main difference between deacons, deaconesses lies. Just right here in 3:11 primarily. Part of the problem is the word used, translated wives, in verse number 11. The Greek word, you probably don't need to want to know that. It means woman or wives. It can mean either. That's where part of the difficulty is. Paul's not referring to women in general, as he did in chapter 2, verse 9. But in this section on church officers, he's already dealt with elders at the start of chapter 3. Now he's dealing with deacons. So the mention of women here is within the context of church officers, church ministry. So he's not talking about women in general, but the question then is, who is he talking about in verse 11? The subjects of these qualities. And there's 3 main interpretations on this verse, taken by Reformed evangelical scholars over the centuries. So the first is that the reference is to deaconesses. Some commentators argue that the word wives here refers to deaconesses. It can be translated legitimately woman. They argue from the word likewise. See that in verse number 11. Likewise. They argue that this is introducing a new office. And they argue that because in verse 8, the word likewise is also used, and it introduces a new office there. From verse 1 to 7, Paul's been talking about elders. Now in verse 8, he begins talking about a new office. Deacons likewise must be dignified. So scholars argue in verse 11, here's a third office. Their wives, or the women likewise must be dignified. So they argue from the text here that here's a distinct group. We have the elders, then the deacons. Now we have a new office, the deaconesses. Now they admit that the word wives is a broad term, that it can be wives, it can be women. It does not necessarily mean deaconesses. Patrick Fairbairn, the Scottish theologian who defends women deacons, writes, it is still somewhat strange that the general term woman is employed and not the specific term deaconesses, which would have excluded all uncertainty as to meaning. But scholars argue that it's deaconesses that's being referred to in verse 11. This is not a new view. Maybe you think, well, this has just been concocted by upstarts, wide boys in recent years. This goes a way back to the beginning of the church. Pliny the Younger, writing to the Emperor Trajan in AD 113, writes, I judged it all the more necessary to find out what the truth was by torturing 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses. Clement of Alexandria, died in 215 AD, wrote, we are also aware of all things that the noble Paul prescribed on the subject of female deacons in one of the 2 epistles of Timothy. Origen, the well-known biblical scholar who died in 253 AD, commenting on Romans 16:1, says, there are women deacons in the church, women who have given assistance to so many people who by their good works deserve to be praised by the apostle, ought to be accepted in the diaconate. And so we can go through church history, and we find many references from the very beginning, and often that's significant within historical theology, that there are references at the very beginning to a doctrine or to a practice. In in AD 380, and you can look at this later on. There is the apostolic constitutions. And in those, it's a kind of church manual, and it contains a prayer at the moment of the ordination of deacons. And so one point I want to emphasize about the view that this is deaconesses is that it's not a new view. This is not just something that's happened in the past 20 years. The second point I want to emphasize is that it's not a liberal view. John Chrysostom, for example, who died 407 AD, comments on this verse. Paul is speaking of those who hold the rank of deaconess. John Calvin writes in his Institutes, if you want the reference, 4:13:19, deaconesses were appointed to perform a public ministry of the church toward the poor and to labor with all zeal, assiduity, and diligence in offices of charity. And Charles Spurgeon, whom we admire greatly, claims in a sermon, volume 13, deaconesses is an office that most certainly was recognized in the apostolic churches. And in volume 51, it would be great, he says, if God gave us the privilege of having many sons who all preached the gospel and many daughters who were all eminent in the church as teachers, deaconesses, missionaries, and the like. The point is that understanding this as deaconesses, having deaconesses in the Christian church, it's not a new view, and it's not a liberal view. The second point is that understanding of this is that women referred to here were those who assisted the deacons. They weren't appointed to the office, but they were a group of women who assisted the deacons in their work. William Hendrickson, the Reformed and evangelical commentator, takes this position, and he writes, "These women are the deacons' assistants in helping the poor and needy. These are women who render auxiliary service, performing ministries for which women are better adapted." So his view is they're not ordained, they're not in office, but they assist the deacons in their work. The third position, and the position that our church holds, is that those mentioned here are the wives of deacons. And there's 4 arguments why I support this view and promote this view from our text. The first is that the Greek word used here is used for wives as well as for women. It's the standard word used in the time for wives and for women. And the King James Version and the English Standard Version, poring over this word, have chosen to translate it in the text as wives. And that's got to be significant for us. The word is translated wives in verse 2 and in verse 12. And here it's translated wives in verse 11. Why did they not add the possessive there in the Greek? It's here in the English in verse number 11, their wives. It's not there in the Greek. But the answer probably is that within the context, it's clear whose wives they are. They're the wives of the deacons who are being referred to. So Paul doesn't use a specific word as he does for elders and as he does for deacons in this verse. If he was indicating a further office, we would expect the apostle to use a special word as he does for elders and deacons. A second argument is the flow of thought in this passage. And there are 2 aspects of the passage's thought which impinge on our position. The first is the parallel nature of the qualities mentioned in verse 11. So here the wives, and you've got to have seen this in our reading. The wives must be dignified. And that's the first thing said about the deacons in verse 8. The deacons must be dignified. The deacons are not to be double-tongued, and the wives are not to be slanderers. The deacons are not to be addicted to wine. The wives are to be sober-minded. The deacons are not to be greedy of dishonest gain, hold the mystery of the faith. The wives are to be faithful in all things. So there is this mirror, there is this parallel which indicates that the wife is matching her husband in these qualities that are required. Paul speaks about deacons. In verse 12 and 13, he'll speak again about deacons. It's unlikely that in between speaking about deacons and then speaking again about deacons, he's going to speak about a different office in the middle. The flow of thought of the passage supports the position that it's the wives of deacons that's mentioned here. A third point is that only men were appointed as deacons in Acts chapter 6, which we read together. The problem was with the widows within Jerusalem. It was women who had the problem, and logic and rationale might indicate, well, if women have this problem with the distribution of food and money, then women should address that problem. Would that not make it easier? But they appointed men to address that problem. And here in the use of deacons in verse 8, in verse 12 especially, the husband of one wife, it's men who are in mind in this passage. Fourthly, the qualities mentioned in verse 11 are minimal. There's no marriage standard mentioned. There is no testing required of the person in verse 11 as there are for deacons and for elders. And so this would indicate that this person in verse 11 is not in an office, but rather they have this supporting role of one who is in office. And so for these reasons, our church holds, and we are promoting within our congregation at this time, that the person referred to, the people referred to in verse 11, are, as translated here, their wives, the wives of deacons. John Calvin did teach that there should be deacons. He didn't have deacons in Geneva. He bemoans this fact. He calls out on an exposition on 1 Timothy 5. He says, where today are the widows who have this honorable office? We do not have such an organization that Paul sets out here. And he said this was a shame on the church that they didn't have deacons. There were kind of deacons within the church in Geneva, widows who were mature, who were over 60, who cared for orphans, who were supported by the benevolent fund within Geneva. They were involved in the diaconal work within the Genevan church, though they were not themselves appointed to that office. Those who oppose our position cite the example of Phoebe in Romans 16, verses 1 and 2. In Romans 16, 1 and 2, she is called a servant of the church, and that is the same word for deacon. And this is where this argument and discussion has arisen from. Was she officially a deacon, or did she do diaconal work? An important distinction for us. Calvin thinks she was a deacon. He mentions her office. He says she performed a most honorable and holy function in the church. But we would understand the term to refer to the type of work deacons do. Ministries of mercy and compassion, as many other women within the Old and New Testament fulfilled. Many women ministered to Christ. Matthew 27:55 says, Paul mentions women who labored side by side with me in the gospel, Philippians 4:3. He talks about Priscilla, a fellow worker in Christ Jesus, Romans 16:13. Professor Leahy has written a very helpful paper on deaconesses within the Reformed Church, and he concludes that paper with this wise advice. Conservative Reformed churches need to consider carefully how they use the talents of godly women. This can be done without appointment to any office. Too often there is the tendency to disregard the opinions of women, forgetting that frequently some of the finest minds in the congregation are those of women. So our position then in the first part, the subjects of verse 11 are the wives of deacons. Secondly, the substance. Let's come then to the qualities that are mentioned here. And there's 4 qualities set out here for the wives of deacons. And as you consider voting for deacons, you're not just to think of the men, you're to think of their wives as well. Here are qualifications set out for the wives of deacons, of those who will be voted. Dignified, a general term. A summary term meaning respected. What the wife of a deacon is to be respected for is in the following 3 terms. Not malicious gossips. The Greek word for malicious gossips is the same word for devil. Slander is the devil's work. It divides congregations, it hurts people. One commentator writes, malicious gossips create division, hatred, suspicions. Malicious gossipers exhibit confused judgment, uncontrolled speech. They're controlled by unrestrained passions such as anger, jealousy, bitterness, wounded feelings, pride, or mental disorder. Not malicious gossips. God blesses peacemakers. He expects us to live in love and truth, to heal wounds, to mend broken relationships, to repent, to forgive. But a malicious talker is someone venting anger, hurting, tearing down. Proverbs 6 describes 7 things which God hates. One is sowing discord among the brothers. And this point is so important, isn't it? It's so important for us as we go through this process of choosing deacons, because the wife of a deacon will get a lot of material that she could gossip about. As the deacon reaches out to people struggling financially, intellectually, within their marriage, within their health, he's going to learn, and so she's going to learn a lot of information about members of the church. The wife of the deacon must be discreet. Secondly, sober-minded. That is, possessing stable character, a woman who has a balanced judgment, self-control. It's used in a narrow sense in relation to wine. It's used here in a wider sense of the mental and emotional sobriety of a person's overall character, speech, and control. Strauss says, describes a person who's stable, circumspect, self-restrained, clear-headed, able to remain composed in all circumstances, sober-minded. And lastly, faithful in all things. In the setting of 1 Timothy, Paul will describe in chapter 5 some of the women who had turned aside from the faith. This was the background to him writing this verse. And so this point about being faithful in all things was so poignant, so timely. Faithful in their marriage, faithful to their family, faithful to their church. It describes someone who's reliable, loyal, trustworthy, dependable. We have the phrase, don't we? Behind every great man is a great woman. Phrase created in 1904 to recognize the role women played in the life of many successful businessmen and leaders. In a recent poll of the popularity of the royal family, Catherine is the most popular. Not William, not Charles, not Harry. This is the point being made here for us. We've not been asked to look for perfection in the wives of deacons, but we are being asked to give attention to these three specific areas. Are the wives strong in these areas? We've not been asked to look for them having a high IQ, but we've been asked to look for godliness and grace. In your preparation for voting, talk to the men. Find out about the men, but also talk to their wives and get to know them. And lastly, the significance of these qualities. You probably have two questions about this, and the first is, why are the wives of deacons mentioned? Why is this verse here? This is unusual. Well, the wives are nearest, as we've said, to the deacons. They play a role in their work, an important role in their work. Guy Waters writes, in the light of the sensitivities surrounding deacons' work, and in the light of the fact that wives may be called on to assist their husbands, particularly in addressing the needs of the church's women, one could see why Paul mentions that the church be satisfied with the character of a candidate and his wife as they assess his suitability for the diaconate. Maybe you're asking why the wives of deacons are mentioned when the wives of elders were not mentioned. Strauch answers that by saying the nature of the eldership is to rule over the congregation. But the nature of the deacons is different. It's a ministry of compassion, a ministry of mercy, a ministry of reaching out to the poor, to the impoverished, to the persecuted, to the burdened, in which the wives can have a full and fruitful and effective role. Just as in marriage, we marry the woman or the man, but we get a whole new family as well. So in electing a deacon, we're including the wife of the deacon in the office and in the work. And so in one sense, we're not electing women to the office of deacon. But in another sense, we are electing women to the office of deacon. The wives of deacons will naturally and willingly, I'm sure, be fully involved in the work of their husband. We have this already in our deacons. A wife runs the coffee after church. Another wife teaches in Sabbath school as a CY leader. Another wife cooks at Nosh and Natter. They are involved in the diaconate work. Thus, at our election of deacons, as you put your name down on the voting slip, you're putting down to all intents and purposes the name of the man's wife as well. She will be the person, most likely, that will say to her husband in due time, you have to do something about those church pew cushions. They came out with Noah out of the ark. They've lost their effectiveness. Or you need to look at painting the outside of the building. It's coming a bit shabby, is it not? Or it was freezing in church today. That heating or the timer, it needs looked at. Or can you not sort another data projector for the other side of the pulpit? It'll be the wife who's far more practical than the man, that will see jobs and things to be done. This is one instance where the complementary nature of man and woman is evident. In the church diaconate. And thus, to furnish our congregation and any Christian congregation with a winning formula, with a dream team and practical leadership in a congregation, the wives of potential deacons are also to be considered. I think this is an exciting time in the life of Ard's congregation to be a deacon or the wife of a deacon. There are many current and new projects which 3 new deacons and their wives, along with our current deacons and their wives, could throw themselves into, begin, or develop. We have 7 Lower Mary Street to renovate and kick out. Please keep the men away from selecting the decor. The wives of deacons are the ideal for that task. And what will we do with the building? There's a blank page before us, which the deacons and their wives can begin to fill up with compassionate ministries for our congregation and our community. A bereavement group, perhaps. A coffee morning a few times a week for the lonely. A Christianity Explained course. An after-schools homework club, maybe. A breakfast club. God will guide us all as we seek him, as we offer ourselves to him, and he will provide ministries that at this moment we have never even thought about. But we will only serve him. Serve him well. Serve him long as deacons wives, as elders, or as members, as we respond to him who served us. He said in Mark 10:45, I came not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life a ransom for many.